Today, I'm happy to continue the conversation I began with Henry Davis regarding his book, Creating Christianity, A Weapon of Ancient Rome. For those who may be unfamiliar with his work, just to reiterate, in his book he asserts that the Gospels and most of the New Testament in the Bible were masterminded by a group of Roman elites led by an individual, Arius Calpurnius Piso, then later adopted as the state religion when Emperor Constantine allegedly received a divine vision of the cross and a voice saying, "In this sign you shall conquer." Based on our last discussion, a variety of questions have come up, and today I'm happy to welcome Henry Davis back so we could dig in and deal with those questions. Henry, thank you very much for coming back to continue this discussion.
No problem. Thanks for inviting me back.
Today, what I wanted to deal with is just to start to kind of kick us off, the general congregation of academics and believers who approach this subject and what the various schools of thought are regarding the historical authenticity of the life of Jesus. I believe that by exploring these different perspectives and categorizing them properly will be helpful to establish the parameters of this discussion and where the Piso theory fits into it.
Yeah.
I believe, Henry, that you fall into the category of what would be called a mythicist. Does that sound correct to you?
I guess I'd have to agree. Yeah. Based on the information I've sort of learned and understood, and based on the gospel stories, I'd have to say I'm a mythicist, because the information I've sort of investigated and understood is quite different to what's being taught in mainstream academia. So I can understand why people would be sort of on the fence. They think, okay, it must have been a guy, but it's more there's more complex information that needs to be understood before someone can say, I suppose, reach my standing of why I don't think there was a historical Jesus.
Yeah, so looking it up, mythicist essentially means that Jesus as a historical figure never existed as described in the New Testament, and that his story is an entire fabrication of human imagination, although perhaps based on some historical figure or an amalgamation of figures. Does that sound about right to you?
Yeah. I mean, when the argument's made, I guess, saying that Jesus is based on an historical figure, I'd have to agree with that. But again, from my position, I'm agreeing with it from a different perspective, based again on the evidence. The ministry of Jesus seems to be paralleling the military campaign of the guy, Vespasian's son, Titus Flavius, but that's what Joseph Atwill concluded, I believe. But actually, it's more, the individual Arius Calpurnius Piso. So the ministry of Jesus is based on the Arius Calpurnius Piso guy and what he did in Judea, and then obviously to kind of build out the character of Jesus, you've got an amalgamation of different gods from around the Mediterranean going in there, and different philosophies and things like that.
Yeah, that's what I think is uniquely interesting about the character of Jesus is when you look at all the different pieces that go into the creation of that character and you understand the different mythologies of the surrounding area, Rome, Judea, the Mediterranean area in general.
Yeah.
All of that seems to kind of have gone into a blender, and out of that comes Jesus.
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah. So there's, to take a look at that word mythicist, is to define yourself differently than somebody who would say that, yes, there was a historical Jesus and the accounts written in the gospel were based on that person. And what Jörn and others are saying is, no, not directly. There wasn't a specific person of Jesus. It was an amalgamation of stories and myths and gods and perhaps real world people as well. But that on some level, those, like, if I'm not mistaken, there's, I know that there's an individual, if I'm, okay, correct me if I'm wrong on this, but that there is an individual that is mentioned in the works of Josephus who's named Jesus, but he's more of a military leader for the Jewish revolt against the Romans. Am I correct in that?
Yeah, I believe it's Jesus, son of Damnius. I believe that's the one you're referring to. Is that the one? Because there's a few mentioned. I know the one that people or is mentioned and is the Christ mentioned in Antiquity, the 20.9.1, but it's referring to Jesus, son of Damnius. But of course, an educated reader around that time wouldn't know that because this material would be read to them. And I imagine, from what I've read and understood, is that Josephus' works were only meant for like the elite readers. They weren't meant for general public readers. So, I mean, there's a lot of mentions. I mean, we have like sort of the brother of Christ in 29.1 as well. So there's a lot of things going on in Antiquities. I mean, the biggest one's the Testimonium Flavianum. That's the one that seems to be argued quite a bit.
Yeah, I was just looking at that. You just posted. You were talking about that, and the Testimonium Flavium. Is that right?
Flavianum, but you can pronounce it however you want.
Okay. So I recall looking at that years ago. I remember looking at that piece of evidence and it's saying that was a later edition, and your contention is no, it wasn't a later edition. I remember at the time the argument that it was a later edition, it seemed somewhat reasonable in that if you do look at the passage, it does kind of seem disjointed with the rest of the narrative that he's giving. Like it kind of just sort of feels somewhat dropped in there. But it was interesting that you pointed out that you believe that that's not the case. You believe that it was put in there intentionally by Josephus, and that it was, intended to be an Easter egg, maybe you might say, of what it is that they were trying to accomplish.
Yeah, I guess that's that's a nice way to sort of frame it, really, as an Easter egg. For me, the claim that it was inserted later, it seems to be because it wasn't mentioned until time of Eusebius. And again, if you're in the mindset of the current narrative and the current understanding of Christian history, that makes sense. But when you know that, when you have the context of the war, you have the context of only the elite could write, and then when you kind of narrow it down and you look at the evidence and the genealogical evidence, and you connect the various individuals within history that were actively writing at the time, you know that it was a tightly controlled creation of this religion. So for later, so-called Christian writers who were members of the elite and a member of the same family circles, for them to want to draw attention to Josephus's work would be counterproductive, because of what was in there. What they knew what was contained within that work, and it's only sort of recently that it's now becoming more known and investigated, like the parallels and the numbers that make up the names. These individuals that are writing it, Eusebius and so, they would have known what was in those works. So for them to kind of go back into the works of Josephus and put something in just doesn't make any sense, because then they think, oh, what else is in Josephus's work? Let's have a look. Let's investigate this further. They didn't want that to happen. So that's why I believe it was originally there, because the guy who wrote Josephus also was one of the main authors for the gospel writings with his family, his sons, and his close relations. And so if he was writing this Antiquities, which he wrote when he was exiled from Rome under Emperor Domitian, so he had about 15 years to write the Antiquities. So they're carefully written, and by all intents and purposes, you can imagine him thinking to himself, okay, I'm going to historicize my character. He didn't, I don't think he would have known who was going to read it except for his close relations. It certainly wouldn't have been a general public. So you can imagine him going, I'm going to write it. There's no harm in me writing it, because the only people who are going to know is there are my family.
So that begs the question in my mind. This is something that we talked about before, but just to kind of reiterate again, it's something that is kind of fascinating in my mind to try to understand what the early church looked like, because you have two versions of it. You have this idea that's presented in the book of Acts, where you had the apostles running around all over the place, and that they're converting people, and there's all these miracles going on and all this kind of stuff. And that this was, and according to the Gospels, it says, they turned the world upside down. So this is, I know for a certain amount of people, is going to be sort of like a difficult kind of fork in the road to sort of say, like, okay, but wait a second. So if they were just holding on to this information themselves and they weren't doing anything with it, then essentially, so how do we get from there to here, where Christianity is so immersed in our culture? There's a church on every corner. It's ingrained in our culture to this point. And for many Christians, it's this belief that the 300 years prior to Constantine was almost like a golden age for Christianity, that this is when all the good stuff was happening. This is when all the miracles were going on, and this is when everybody was being converted. And then Constantine showed up. He made Christianity the state religion, and at least for Protestants, I would say that they define Constantine as essentially the one who torched the Christian religion and turned it into Catholicism, coming from a Protestant perspective, right? So this is kind of like an example of the cognitive dissonance in this discussion that I know is difficult for some people, where depending on what side of the line you fall in this discussion, like if you're I know that online there's a lot of the discussion of this topic tends to be absorbed mostly by atheistic types, and it's something that I've noticed and I've spoken, and it's something that I'm interested in, because if you're coming from the perspective of, I don't believe this, it must be a fraud, it's much easier to convince somebody like that than it is to convince somebody who says, no, I believe every single word of the Bible is true. And that the history that has been passed down through, and this is sort of the funny thing, is that the history is more often than not has been written by the victors, right? It's been written by Christian scribes and whatnot throughout the years, who have kind of put their version, their spin on everything. So that's the real trouble with the the academic community looking at this outside of the religious community and trying to put the pieces together is that you've got all of this stuff that you have to try to sift through to try to find it, right?
Yeah, for sure.
So what I wanted to kind of on the heels of our last discussion, there was a few comments and questions and some pathways that I sort of went down. And one of the things that I found was interesting that I wanted to bring up was because somebody mentioned it, was Richard Carrier. And I mentioned this to you in the questions that I sent you, but he's an example of a fairly prominent academic in regards to the historicity of Jesus, and he classifies himself as a mythicist. But what I find interesting is that he completely disregards the Piso theory, and the reason that I find that interesting is because he does it so like dismissively, which is really strange to me. It's like, no, that's just a bunch of conspiracy theory bunk is kind of essentially what his position on it is. But then when I've read through his stuff, his ability to explain why he doesn't like the theory is not satisfactory to me. Okay. His way of dealing with it seems to be more along the lines of just demeaning the topic and just sort of anyone who even entertains it, you know what I mean, as far as he's concerned, is not a serious academic. And I will just say that for me, as soon as somebody kind of goes in a direction like that, then it immediately kind of turns me off, because I kind of go like, all right, what's your deal here? Why is it so important for you that this is not true? And why is it that you're spending more energy on dismissing it than you are on explaining why it's not credible? So that right
there's more dismissing than there is explaining why it's being dismissed.
Exactly.
For sure.
Yeah.
Which is why I can't understand, because I mean I could imagine, I suppose, I mean, like I said, I'm not on Twitter a huge amount, just because I prefer to like sort of do more research and make sure I've got like the answers in my head and whatnot. But I do look through.
Twitter is not exactly the best place for that.
No, definitely not.
Mixed results.
There's some good people on there for
sure.
Sure. But I do look through like sort of some comments and things. I don't get a lot, but I do. I suppose I'm aware of Richard Carrier's I suppose past views on the Flavian, the pure Flavian stance of things. I know he was very critical of Jesus Messiah and Joseph Atwell's work.
Yeah.
And I think I read recently that he's kind of like coming around to that more, and you can kind of understand what he's saying.
I heard that as well. Yeah, I heard that as well.
Yeah. But I suppose the thing is, the only thing I can imagine is possibly two points. Possibly, obviously, Joseph Atwell's book is more widely known. That's just a fact. He was able to promote it quite well, and he got it in the papers, got a documentary, and so on. So, and it was kind of like the first, I suppose, properly published mainstream work that brought to light the kind of the Roman providence information.
Sure.
So I can see why, say, Richard Carrier was skeptical at the beginning, but now that he's had a chance to read through some of it, he's not so skeptical. With the Piso stuff, the only thing I can think of is that, like I think I mentioned in the book, my book, is that the Piso information has not been presented in a great way compared to, say, the Jesus Messiah information. So for people to kind of read it, sort of digest it, and then look at it in a sensible way. There just hasn't been an opportunity because of the way it's been presented has put people off. And so I can imagine if he's reluctant to acknowledge the piece of stuff, it's based on the kind of the lack of simple explanation of it. And I wouldn't have thought that Richard Carrier is aware of my book at all. I wouldn't be surprised if he's not. So all I can say is if I guess it'd be nice if he read the book and then he kind of gave feedback on it. That would be good, but I can't. That'd be the reason why I think he's so, or why everyone seems to be so reluctant to the Piso information, because one, is complex, two, it's not been as widely shared as the Flavian information. So until it gets to that stage, I think you're gonna have that.
Yeah, no, for sure. It is definitely, for somebody who was raised in church, and I've absorbed this mythology in a variety of different ways, and then to see to become aware of the Piso angle, and that's something that has happened quite recent, and it's been part of a general unfolding of if you don't mind me saying, revelation that starts with the Gnostic Gospels, right? Being the Dead Sea Scrolls being discovered, and suddenly humanity has a whole pile of new information to sift through that sheds a new light that was previously covered up.
Right. Yeah.
It's something that I think is very interesting and important to point out in this discussion, because I know that with a lot of the discussions that I get into, it's a general animosity towards religious types, and sort of like a disregard for belief. But my stance on it tends to be that the information that we have access to in our modern context is just unprecedented. Prior to we'll say the Gnostic Gospels, I mean, the only information that we had available to us was the Bible and how it was being disseminated through churches, and that's kind of culturally we congregated around that, and it's only because, in my mind, it's only because of modern innovations and because of discoveries like the Dead Sea Scrolls that have shed new light and allowed us to see things that were previously covered up. And
it gives a different context. It just adds a little bit more context to what is going on, instead of just relying, like you said, on just a pure Gospel New Testament account. You had this other context come out, but and so obviously they got the suspicious suppressing of the Dead Sea Scrolls by the Catholic Church for a number of years, and that's the one that kind of, when I started researching this, I was like, wait a minute, they didn't let anyone see them. Why?
That's been kind of like sort of a joke, I think, is, the like, what's the Vatican hiding? You know what I mean? Like, what do they got in there, right? Like, it's this, it's the whole Dan Brown Da Vinci Code thing and everything. The idea that the Vatican is a front for the Illuminati, and these are the secret overseers, and they have all the secret information of humanity, and they're withholding it from us, right? It's an interesting narrative. It's an interesting way of looking at things, especially when you kind of consider the idea of Arius Piso being an elite royal who was sifting through a lot of information and putting it together in such a way it seems as though his intention was to create a new religion. And that's another part of this that I just think is interesting. The fact that this was all kind of like a family affair. He masterminded this, but then you're talking about how his sons and daughters were involved, and this was a whole.
Well, his dad, uncle, and other relatives they were the ones that kind of sort of took it seriously in the beginning. There is information in some of the books I got that it started earlier than that, by I think one of the grandfathers of the Flavian side. But I think that's why the scholars that I read, they say that Mark is so difficult to kind of work out who the actual authors were, because there were so many different people adding their bits to it.
Okay.
So it's kind of like Gaius Piso, Lucius Piso, and others that started it and then had to come away from it when Nero kind of got wind of it, and then after Arius Piso's dad died, and after the war, that's when it kind of started to Arius and his family started to put their mark on it.
This is if correct me if I'm wrong, but this is where the tradition of calling, like basically saying that Nero was killing a lot of Christians and that he burned Rome down and blamed it on the Christians and all that. This is essentially like a propaganda hit job that they did on him because of
for sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
So when you're talking about his dad and how he kind of started this off, and if I'm not mistaken, Seneca was involved as well.
Seneca the Younger, I believe. Yeah.
Okay, and this was. Let me see if you could just explain exactly how you see this was working out. But his dad, and correct me if I'm wrong, but him and Seneca were the ones who allegedly put together the Q document that Mark was based on. Is that right? The theoretical Q document.
The theoretical. Yes. I have to remember now. I believe it's the Q document. By deduction, looks to be a letter within the works of Seneca, and it's titled "A New Book" by Lucilius, which is basically Lucius. And in there,
that was his first name, right?
Lucius Piso. Yeah, that was the uncle of Arius Piso. Yeah.
Okay. Huh.
And
so is the uncle then?
Yes, it seems to be. Well, it seems to be.
See if you could just kind of unravel.
Yeah, if I have a look, because that's one that's. I mean, the Q document's been like sort of like discussed by everyone and their mother, I think. Just because it's like so difficult to kind of work out whether there was a Q document, if there wasn't. But I think the Q document was basically a kind of. It was a prototype for Mark, but trying to get the right tone and the right content in the book, and just trying to sort of. I think it was probably sent to Seneca by Lucius to get his thoughts on it, because as Bruno Bauer kind of discussed and concluded, that the works of Seneca, the philosophy of Seneca, is in the New Testament. So I think Lucius and Seneca were kind of working together when Gaius Piso took the rap for the Personal conspiracy. Then Seneca and Lucius started working together on, the Mark letter, and so yeah, I believe it's by Lucius. I'm just trying to find it.
I just a thought on this. It's something that it's kind of my instinct in this regard. You're familiar with the character of Don Quixote, right?
No, I'm not actually.
Okay. Don Quixote was a character book written by Carlos Castaneda.
Okay.
And I read a book about it, and it was basically talking about how Don Quixote was a sage-like character that was created by Carlos Castaneda as kind of a muse, an oracle to present his ideas. The same idea relates to Socrates and Plato. The idea that Socrates was a fictional character that Plato created as basically just a mechanism to present his ideas. Now, I'm not saying that that's the case, but the point that was being made was that the Jesus character was essentially created with the same intention. It was a character that was created as like a sage as like an oracle, you know. It's kind of like if I were to create a character that was a metaphor for Almighty God, you know, and it's like, okay, like here's a character now that we can put that voice in, and that I don't remember where I read it, but it was basically talking about how that's essentially what the character of Jesus was intended to be, is sort of like a literary fabrication that was intended to bring forth wisdom.
Okay.
And that this was kind of the game, you know. This is the game was creating a character that you could put the words into their mouth, and in this case, this whole idea of Almighty God incarnating as a being and dying on a cross and all that kind of stuff, right? But if you know the mythologies of like Egypt and Greece and stuff, then you can find a lot of parallels between the character of Jesus and different characters like Horus and whatnot.
Yeah. I mean that's what they were doing at the beginning. They had so much material. Because the only people that would read and write were those who were able to. Mm-hmm. So they had so much material to kind of like sort of mix together, because they were trying to get the perfect a perfect story. Mm-hmm. So I mean I found what the supposed Q document or Gospel of Mark by a new book by Lucilius is meant to have said. I mean, when Seneca received it, apparently in his letters, he says, I received the book of yours, which you promised me. I opened it hastily with the idea of glancing over it at leisure. And it says that it's got like an eloquent style to it, but it said doesn't resemble your handiwork or mine, but at first sight might have been ascribed to Titus Livius or to Epicurus. And those two people were like, known for their rhetoric, which is basically what's in the New Testament. And it's got like, your style is lofty and noble. I want you to keep this manner and in this direction. Your subject also contributed something. For this reason, you should choose productive topics which will lay hold of the mind and arouse it. So it's basically he's basically like saying to kind of like, get the mind stirring and thinking and trying to kind of like sort of make it think a certain way.
It was intended to be thought provoking.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So this was sent to Seneca.
Apparently, that's what we read.
Okay. And it was sent to Seneca by the uncle of Arius Piso?
Yeah, that's what we read. Okay. It's in his Morals, Volume 1.
Okay. And sorry, what was his uncle name again?
Lucius Piso.
Lucius
Piso, yeah.
So then, arguably, Lucius was the mastermind of this, and Arius saw what he was doing and was like, I'm going to run with it.
Yeah,
But then he took the basic guts of the character and then overlaid this whole sort of, I don't know, metaphor is the right way of saying this, but of the campaign of Titus and Vespasian. Like he took this idea and then injected it into a specific time and place in history.
Well, he kind of took the I suppose he kind of took like the brainstorm of what his uncle and Seneca, I suppose, did, and then from that he kind of created his own sort of more polished product, if you will, and sort of then edited it and sort of like improved upon it over time. There's why you've got like sort of the little different discrepancies in each of the Gospels. But then, I mean, once Gaius Calpurnius Piso died and once Seneca was dead, I can't remember the name, but I think somewhere under an alias name, Arius was responsible for killing his uncle. I can't remember off the top of my head what it was. I think it was due to a dispute in Egypt. And so then, Arius Calpurnius Piso became the leader of the family. So he could basically do what he wanted at that point within reason. I think from what I've read on some of the work that Arius wasn't, or he upset Vespasian for some reason, but I don't think it lasted long. And I think it either upset him, and so that's why under one of his alias names he wasn't like honored or something. But he still carried on in the background writing the other gospel literature with his sons, like training his sons up.
I want to go back to this. Just to clarify, I want to clarify this. What can we, like, I want to see if we could get into this. Like, what did the church look like prior to Constantine? What form was it in? If it wasn't as it was described in the Gospels, and the way that you're suggesting is that it was essentially like a family religion, or it was sort of like something that they believed internally. And the question I have is like, how much? Okay, go ahead. Yeah.
No. Carry on.
Well, like, I guess my question is just how was this originally? Like, what if we could go into a time machine right now, and we could go back to Rome and we could like watch as this was unfolding, what did it look like? How was the Gospels? How are the Gospels being disseminated? Was it just entirely internally? Was there any growth? Was this actually evolving into a religion, into a cult?
Well, it would have. Well, I mean, at the beginning, it sounds like, from what I've read, it sounds like they converted old pagan temples around the empire to try and get people to listen to what they were saying.
After Constantine or before?
This is before.
Okay.
They would go around converting old pagan temples, and there's old, because I mean some of the first churches were brothels. Under
what authority were they doing this?
Well, they would have had the blessing of in the beginning. They would have had the blessing of Vespasian and Titus.
Okay.
But because they were, because they were the same family, then they had the same goals. I mean, Vespasian and Titus don't seem to have actually taken an active role in promoting it, but they let it happen. And so Arius Piso and I think I'll say Pliny the Younger, just because of what I've read, what Roman Piso stated, and it makes sense based on the research I've done for the next book. They went round with their sons, and I think Arius Piso's daughter traveled to one place. Her name's actually in the New Testament, and they kind of like set up little churches with chambers on the sides. So when the churches weren't making any money, because where they were doing it in like Antioch, they were being driven out by, the Jewish population there, because the Jewish population knew exactly what was going on. It was too soon after,
Right.
the war.
Right.
So they were driven out, and they weren't making any money to keep the churches going, because they didn't want to use their own wealth. So they resorted to prostitution, which was a custom that was in the old temples as well. There was, side temples in the old temple that you paid for a prostitute. And so from there, you have the kind of it gets confusing from there, because Paul at Pliny the Younger is going around the Mediterranean for years, sort of like building things up, and then they also created churches in their houses, and it must have been on like the upper levels of their houses, and they invited people in to worship in there, which is why we see archaeological finds of to that nature.
Okay.
And then obviously there was still trouble with the Jews in Egypt, in Alexandria. There was a lot of trouble in Alexandria, which I've got to write an article about. And so the Jews are still sort of fighting, rebelling, and so you can see under various different names which are related to the different ancestors of the Piso family. The sons, the later generation, are trying to work out how to sort of again get the Jews to get them to rebel, so that they could have a reason to go in and kill them off in Alexandria as well. And then it kind of like sort of it fizzles out. So Christianity never really takes off. They may have had a few followers ish here and there, maybe more like the slaves, sort of kind of like being mind warped.
Sure.
But most of what we hear are believers within the documents are basically the family sort of portraying themselves as believers, because you can see it in the names they use. And so it fizzles out, and then obviously you've got the kind of crisis of the 3rd century, where you've got a battle not only between the different members of the elite families, kind of like some in favor of promoting Christianity and some in favor of the traditional pagan religions like the sun god worship. And so there's like a clash there between that period. And then you have like sort of family sort of feuds. And then throughout that period, obviously you've got the invasions coming in, so they can't really the Romans can't invade other countries to get their wealth. They have to like sort of protect what they've already got from other invaders going in. So it's kind of like a bit of a bad period. And then you under the surface, if you don't just read the surface literature, under the surface you can see that Constantine and his brother and his kind of like supporters, his family supporters, they eventually managed to kill off the people, the other members of the family who are opposing their wanting to promote Christianity. And you again, I got to like sort of do a lot more articles to explain it. And so once Constantine kills his last family members that are standing in his way, then Constantine and his half brother Eusebius, they basically start to kind of like sort of get the ball rolling. Obviously it wasn't made official by Constantine. He just basically gave the blessing and said, I've had a vision, I'm going to be a Christian. And then obviously under Theodosius it becomes more official, but again it doesn't seem to be anything until much later again. I mean, you get more money going into Christianity under Constantine, but there's no destroying of pagan temples, because it would be counterproductive. Because if Constantine came in and said, "Oh, I'm destroying your pagan temples," then it caused more trouble. There'd be uproar.
Do you think that's one of the reasons why it initially failed? Because I'm thinking about the reaction to some royal elites going around and suddenly renovating a bunch of pagan temples and saying, "Hey, this is going to be a Christian temple now." Right. And I can't imagine that went over well.
Well, I wouldn't have thought that the people would have known who they were, because I mean, if we think about it today, I mean, they might have known, but from my own thinking, if you think about today, if we didn't have TV or papers or radio or whatever, would we know what the royals looked like? Sure. Would we? I mean, the ones that were public-facing royals were Vespasian and Titus, and now they were in Rome or wherever they were. They were dealing with the affairs of the state and whatnot. But the Pisa family, they were like, other members of the royal family, other members of the aristocracy. That, I mean, for example, over here in the UK, we only see, Queen Elizabeth, Prince Charles, Prince William, on TV and the papers. You very, very, very rarely hear of other royals. You don't really see them. Sure. So, and that's now with TV and radio and papers. Back then, there was none of that. So sure. It's very likely that the people that they were promoting this to, even the Jewish people, wouldn't even know who they were. So.
But it would still, I would imagine, be enforced by perhaps some soldiers showing up and saying, "Hey, we're going to be renovating this place now, by decree of the emperor," or something like that.
Well, possibly. I mean, that might be why they were. That might be one of the reasons why they were driven out.
Well, just to, this is kind of me trying to wrap my head around this when I think of what the Flavians were trying to accomplish, right? They had just become the emperors after a 4-year period of civil war, if I'm not mistaken. And they were trying to establish their dynasty, right? They were trying to prove in the minds of the people that they were the chosen ones, that they were the ones to now be ruling Rome after the Caesarian line ended with Nero, right?
Right.
So that's kind of like, if I'm putting the pieces together in my own mind, then I'm like, okay, this is where they are trying to establish their own, like, not only are they trying to establish their own dynasty, but they're also trying to establish their own divinity. And this is I think being pushed by Piso, who's saying, "Hey, I've got this great idea, and if you let me carry this through, then I will, I'll create a new religion that's based around you." But secretly, he's kind of like putting as much of himself into it as he can, right? He's kind of sees himself as like, that's kind of my impression, that he sees himself as like the chosen one, and that he's. But this is kind of where I sort of see that his hubris eventually became his undoing, and that I'm just putting the pieces together here. I wonder whether or not there was outcry to them trying to renovate things for Christianity, and at some point the Flavians went, "Hey man, your plan is not working, people are getting pissed off, so we're gonna go ahead and just scrap it," and that's about the point where he gets exiled, I'm guessing, where there's like a falling out between him and the Flavians.
There is when Domitian comes to power.
Okay.
Yeah. He exiles Arius and I believe his mother and his sister.
But prior to that, there was never any falling out between Piso and the Flavians, Titus and Vespasian?
There doesn't seem to be. No, there might have been a little bit of a rift recorded under one of Arius's names. It wasn't enough to exile him.
Okay.
The Vespasian might just got pissed off with him about something.
Right. But I'm guessing then maybe this is what Domitian did to try to endear himself to the populace by saying, hey, you know, my dad and my brother, they tried to take away your religion, but I'm going to bring it back. And that I'm like, again, like I'm just kind of putting the pieces together in my own mind and saying like, what fits, you know, and like, how does this unfold?
Well, there's kind of, I haven't gone into it much, but I know that from what I've read, there's parallels in Book of Revelation that relate to Domitian, and I can kind of, if that's the case, I can kind of understand, because if Domitian wasn't on friendly terms with Arius, as the case seems to be, then possibly Domitian may have worked with Arius's son Julius, who authored the Book of Revelation. Well, he started it, and it must have been his son or grandson that finished it off, because Julius was killed by Hadrian. It's very possible that because it seems that Julius was against creating Christianity, because of what he writes in the Revelation about his father, he may have been on good terms with Domitian, sort of painting him as, you know, the God guy at that point. But how
does he do?
Okay.
Okay. I was just like how was he referring to Domitian in the Book of Revelation?
I think it's I can't remember offhand the specifics of it. There's something about like it may have been something to do with like the Trinity or the Triangle or something like that. But don't quote me on that. I'd have to go back and read it. I haven't focused too much on Domitian, just because it's not. I don't see it as a main important piece of it, except for when he banishes Arius. That's as much as I've looked into Domitian.
So he banishes Arius, and Arius dies shortly after this?
No. Okay. Well, Arius writes the Antiquities.
Okay.
So Domitian banishes Arius for things approximately 15 years, and Arius goes to Greece, because I think the Piso family had a farm there in Bithynia, which I think was at the base of Mount Olympus, I've read.
Okay.
So he's kind of you know, like sort of there and wandering around that kind of area. He may have been sort of like going around there and sort of like trying to preach the gospel or whatever he was doing, but we know that he wrote the Antiquities, because that's the period in which we know it was written. So that's kind of why it's quite detailed, because, you know, he had the time to write it.
There's something that I kind of want to, I just want to get your impressions on. It's it kind of, okay, so like Christianity has been very successful. It remains incredibly successful and popular today. And this is one of the reasons why I'm interested in digging into this discussion and sort of like dissecting it. Because as somebody who grew up in the church and made efforts to kind of distance myself from it, but to still live in a world where I am aware that that it still has incredible influence and over politics and et cetera, et cetera. And you know, we could say that it's not going anywhere anytime soon. You know, not next year anyways. No. Not in 5 years. You know, maybe 10, 20 years, 30, 50 years. We might be considering
100 years.
Maybe 100 years. But you know, like just thinking of that, I mean, this is kind of the interesting thing about information, is it takes a while for it to get disseminated and sort of like, you know, absorbed into the collective conscious, right? And this is sort of an example of this new information. How to
the complexity of it as well. If it wasn't so complex, it might have been
Mm-hmm.
disseminated a lot quicker. But because it is just so complex, it's
Right.
it you know, you got the complexity of say for myself reading it, investigating it, understanding it, and then thinking, right, okay, how do I explain it?
Yeah. Sure.
And then sometimes when you explain it, people still don't get it. You think, okay, I've got to kind of look at this again and try and figure out how to dumb it down even more, which yeah.
Yeah. No, I know. And I mean, that's kind of one of the reasons why I feel suited to have this discussion with you, because I feel as though I know what the general resistances would be to the information that's being presented. And I'm willing to go the extra mile to try to like look at it honestly and ask questions about it and see, okay, where does this information lead?
Yeah.
And for me, one of the things that I'm just, it's in my brain and just kind of like trying to figure out, and that is, if Arius is as presented, is this kind of almost demonic figure, you know, like he's like this just master manipulator who is intent on creating this new religion and getting it off the ground and everything, right? Yeah. But then what I kind of look at is I kind of go, is there a human being in there somewhere? Is there an individual who did have altruistic intentions and really did believe that this was something important to bring to the world, or were his motivations entirely selfish? And the reason that I ask that question is because as dark as the character of Piso can be when you look at him in a certain light, when you look at the character of Jesus and you look at a lot of the things that he says, I mean, the way that I see, you know, rationalize it in my mind is I'm like, there's a reason the character is so popular. There's a reason that it has stood the test of time. And one of the things that I kind of draw a connection to is I think of actually the creation of Batman and the original writer Bob Kane. And if you look at the character of Batman and you look at the person of Bob Kane by many accounts was not a likable individual, right. But he created this icon of justice, and you know, this sort of like this character that is a metaphor for vengeance and justice and all, you know, whatever, right? So I almost kind of draw like I sort of try to draw these modern parallels to these ancient events and sort of see like what is the humanity going on there at the time, and part of me kind of it just kind of says there's a reason that this character has been so popular. There's a reason that it has stood the test of time. And it's kind of like, apart from the character of Piso himself and whatever his nefarious reasons might be, there's still something I think that resonates with people when they hear, you know, love your neighbor as yourself, and turn the other cheek if your enemy gives you, you know, so that to me, there's these stories, these parables and stuff that Jesus talks about, and they seem so contrary to the darkness of the Piso character as presented, because he's presented in a very nefarious light is kind of my take on it. But then when I kind of take a little bit of a closer look at it and I say, okay, like maybe there was some altruistic intent to this guy. Maybe he really did believe in this story, believe that it was worth bringing to light for whatever reason. And I think
he's probably a psychopath.
Well, that's the thing. It's like it's like
psychopath.
Right. But I mean, it's like the other modern parallel I might bring would be like L. Ron Hubbard, you know, an individual who just, it was his obsession to, you know, L. Ron Hubbard allegedly has written more fiction than anybody else who has ever lived. I don't know if that's accurate or not, but he wrote like a bunch of short stories and all sorts of, like, before he finally created Scientology and the basic They're the basic story.
I wondered where I'd heard the name before. I was thinking, where have I heard that name before? Yeah, Scientology.
Yeah. So I mean, he's he's the creator of Scientology, and you kind of then you look at Joseph Smith and how he came up with Mormonism, and then I kind of look at all those parallels and say, okay, so how does that relate to this thing that happened 2,000 years ago?
Well, it's all manipulation, and you've got to have a sort of screw loose to have the drive to put that much effort in to create something that's so manipulative.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, like Scientology is more like geared towards celebrities.
Right.
I think, isn't
is that maybe what modern or early Christianity was? Like they were trying to appeal to intellectual Romans and say like, hey, we've got a really cool new religion, you should check it out, right?
Well, yeah, I think that's what the the epistles of letters of Paul, that was the kind of motive there. I think, because their initial first target were obviously the commoners and I think the Jews and then they went to like the Greeks to try and turn the Greeks against the Jewish people. I think that's why there's so much confusion over what Paul writes. So, especially in the Romans, like sort of is he writing to any Romans when he's writing to the epistle to the Romans? Because it doesn't seem to be that there is any, which there wasn't. But it's I think their initial target audience for this religion was trying to target the Jewish slaves as well as the slaves around the Roman Empire and in the Roman army as well, because a lot of them had turned to Judaism as well. And then it at that point it didn't work. I mean, it is obvious why it didn't work, because it was still fresh in people's minds. The war just ended, and so I think that I think there's an air of that, of like they try to read it to their family members and other members of the elite, and then so that the elite can kind of maybe indoctrinate their slaves, and whatnot, but making sure that it stays very tight within the elite family and doesn't the slaves and other people don't get copies of the scriptures. They're kept within
Yeah, this is so like in our last conversation I brought up Brian Murarescu's book The Immortality Key.
Yeah.
And he's just kind of in his own separate research, he's looking at the early psychedelic rites and sacraments essentially that were being used in Dionysian rituals, the worship of Dionysus and Bacchus, who was the god of wine. And according to Brian Murarescu, the god of pharmaceuticals. I'm trying to think of the word now that he uses, pharmacia or something like that. But essentially that the early, what he talks about is this ancient religion called Eleusis, and that Eleusis was the best kept secret in the world, that it was sort of like it's like Fight Club, you don't talk about Eleusis. But essentially what it was an initiation using psychedelics in order to have some kind of a divine experience, right? Yeah. And the way that I sort of visualize it in my mind is like, okay, these ancient temples this was like their kind of common thing, right? Is they probably had mushrooms or whatever that they were growing. I believe in his book he talks about ergot spiked beer. Ergot is I guess it's a psychedelic that's produced by wheat, if I'm not mistaken. When wheat,
I'll have to try that.
Yeah. But what the reason I kind of say all that is because I'm trying to visualize this ancient brand new cult that is being led by this Arius Calpurnius Piso, and he is trying to get his family into it. He's trying to get his friends into it. He's trying to like cause this thing to happen.
Yeah.
And when you look at these early Christian churches that were transformed from pagan temples, then it's sort of like, how did they get people on board? And my assumption is that they are saying like, hey, we've got this cool new ritual, it's similar to the one that you're familiar with, but it's this whole other thing. You got to try it out, and it's like, and the way I see it is sort of guided. It's like a guided meditation or a guided psychedelic trip, where you've got some individual who's drawing you into the presence of Bacchus, like, can you feel him around you? He's speaking to you now, like this whole thing, right?
Yeah.
You could see kind of modern parallels, especially if you look at some of these evangelical videos of people, they're getting prayed for and they're getting all, crazy, and it's I think it's a
partner loves watching videos of that. Evangelical, on Sunday when they do all the
Sure.
Oh no, she likes the sort of like the what they call it, the kind of gospel kind of singing, the upbeat type. She likes to watch it. She just thinks it's funny. And she said, "Oh, I'd love to join that. I said, go enjoy one then."
Well, that's like it's a part of this that I think just can't be ignored. It's sort of like from an outside perspective, why is this so popular? Why is it so attractive? Why is it that 2,000 years later people still gravitate towards it? And at least part of it, I think, is this emotional experience, this emotional outlet. Continue.
Well, I mean, with with the kind of sort of psychedelic, influences, back when they were first starting out. I mean, you've got the eat, drink, and be merry sort of statement within the New Testament, and so that can be like reference to like them eating, drinking what you said, and then be merry is basically fornicating.
Sure.
It's a ancient sort of terminology for fornicating, just like feet is, and hands. They're euphemisms for penis, basically. And I think God and Anatomy publication came out, and it references it in there. But I think why it's sort of taken a hold of people down through the centuries is, one, at the start because of the power behind it.
Sure.
Eventually, it wasn't anything until Constantine was able to pursue it, and then after that it got built up. So then the money went into it, but you weren't allowed to read it for yourself. So the people were told whatever they were told. They were probably told the good bits that are in and not the bad bits.
Well, the iconography of it is like, I've said this before, it is master branding. I mean, Constantine was like a pioneer in this regard. He took the cross and turned it into the icon of his religion, right? It's the simplicity of it is almost its power, right? The icon of the picture of Jesus, the Son of God and stuff like that. Like, just the idea, whether you understand the details, the visual, it grabs you, and then for him to say, like I likened this before, to me it's like sporting teams, it's like, hey, we've got cool new jerseys, we've got a cool new, and we're going to get the rest of the world to follow us, whether they like it or not.
Well, I know that there's been like scientific studies done. I've got to read through it, but it sounds interesting initially that that if you're religious, then I think there's like sort of some kind of a mental handicap for those that are religious. It kind of like sort of, it does something to certain parts of the brain that sort of makes their brain not think sort of in a way that
I can
you
attest to
would.
that.
Yeah. I don't
No,
wanna
this is
say
actually no, this is actually a process that I went through. You know, like I was probably about 30 or something like that when I was really just. I was actually getting into Carl Jung and a lot of his ideas as far as like individuation and psychology and archetypes and whatnot, and so I was kind of doing some just meditation and some psychological introspection. And also at the time, you know, what was going along with this was just a desire to be more creative and use my imagination and you know, kind of go in that direction. And what all that leads to is just what I found was that my upbringing, the psychological connections that were made as a child growing up, that, you know, those things, they don't necessarily go away the moment that you renounce your religion or your belief. You know, a lot of that stuff lingers.
Well, yeah,
And so for me, the lingering effect was it, even though I'm like intellectually, I'm saying I don't believe in Jesus anymore, I don't believe in Christianity, I think it's a farce. There's still these psychological connections that don't necessarily go away. And for me, as
I think a lot of it's it's got to do with the kind of not necessarily believing in the you know, the magical Jesus guy, but because you know, apparently on the surface there's, you know, testimonies or you know, evidence of people other than outside the biblical world mentioning, you know, Christians and stuff. I think that's where like sort of some of the issue comes in, is that, well, okay, I don't believe in the magical Jesus guy, but surely the guy must have existed because we have these you know, references to him, and, you know, sort of like Tacitus and Josephus and, you know, and Nazareth. You know, what's Nazareth got to do with anything? If this guy didn't come from Nazareth, Nazareth must have existed, so Jesus must have existed, this physical guy. So I think it's kind of like I think it's a mental battle in that case, because yes, you've kind of you know, you've kind of renounced the magicalness of it, but
there you go.
It's kind of like, okay, wait a minute, but we've got these contemporary witnesses, and I think that's what trips people up, because again, it's okay saying, you know, I think the biggest and the strongest argument at the moment is the Nazareth one, because I mean, many scholars have doubted what Tacitus is saying and what Suetonius is saying, but people they say, well, you know, Nazareth is there, you know, there's no reason to have Nazareth if the guy didn't come from Nazareth. But then again, it comes down to looking through it and looking at the evidence for, did that word exist at the time of Jesus? And we have no evidence that it did exist. Obviously, absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. But when you haven't got anything, and then you've also got people forging, you know, inscriptions that are apparently from the synagogue in Nazareth, which turn out to be fake, and then you don't have anything else, then, you know, for me, I look at the techniques that I've had to learn and use throughout this entire work, and that is looking at the name. Why did they come up with the name Nazareth? I mean, what does it mean? Does it mean anything specific to the aristocracy? Does it mean something specific at that time? And when you I mean, obviously, when you kind of look into it, I know various people have said it, you know, it means the root, you know, the Greek form of the Hebrew word netzer, meaning branch, you know, the root and branch of messianic lineage, which, you know, is logical. But then it's kind of like, okay, it's not really enough. But then when you, again, split the word up, and you have, at the end of Nazareth, you have the aret word. The meaning of aret means excellence or moral virtue. And basically it was used to define the aristocracy. So basically, they were seen as exemplary of arete, in other words, a model of excellence. And the root word of the word arete, as in, Nazareth, is the same as the word aristo or aristos, which was used plurally to indicate the nobility. Now, the word aristo links to the New Testament. For example, in Matthew 26:26, we read, take, eat my body. And then in Matthew 22:4, we read, behold my dinner. Now, the Greek word for dinner is aristo. And this word also ties in with Apollo, whose son was Aristeos. And Apollo appears in a virgin birth story similar to Jesus's, where he impregnates a woman whose husband is called Ariston. Now, that's where some people may stop. But in terms of what's in my book and in my work, it seems like there's an individual called Titus Claudius Ariston, who is a leading citizen of Ephesus in Bithynia, where the Pisos governed, and it was the location of one of the early churches. And that name seems to be another name for Arius. Now, if that's the case, it kind of ties in. So it means that, Jesus of the root of the aristocracy, or Jesus the root of Arius, kind of thing. But is an example of just how complex and how much piecing together you kind of have to do.
Right. Yeah, no, this, to me, when I think of the more that I look at this, the more that I think of the individuals involved, the more that I see them as almost like scientists in terms of their apprehension of the data that they're sifting through, and how they're putting it together, the way that they're able to draw connections and they're really sophisticated connections, these are not unintelligent people. These are incredibly well-informed people. And where my brain goes in this is I just think of what the upbringing of someone like Piso must have been, the information that he was exposed to. And it seems as though his interest just happened to gravitate towards, these mythologies and sort of this esoteric information that he was able to intellectualize in such a way that it's like a puzzle, right? It's like a very, very complex puzzle. And I might even liken it to the complexity of designing a video game. When you look at the you play a video game and you're like, how the hell did somebody do this? You know what I mean? How did somebody make this? This is incredible. Well,
it's a modern version of code, isn't it? They've created their own. I mean, I know that the word code is frowned upon in this context, but code is used for different forms of papyrus. The Caesar cipher, for example, just one example, is a code that Caesar used to relay military messages. So it's a code. They've created a kind of code, not just with the numbers, i.e. 666, but with the way the languages work. So in Hebrew, vowels were rarely used, or they were seen as not being there. So if they knew Hebrew and they knew Latin and they knew Greek, there was nothing stopping them from taking the different rules of one language and use them in another.
Right.
Not that it was going to be read on the surface, but they knew what it meant.
They knew what they were doing. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, no, it's absolutely fascinating. And again, it's sort of to go back to the idea of an Easter egg. It's full of Easter eggs, right?
Yeah.
If you know what to look for, and that's it's like you say, it's complicated to the point that if you don't understand the connections that they're making,
Mm.
then it's very easy to be overwhelmed by the information that's being provided and sucked into it.
Yeah.
It's almost like a book of spells, you know. It's like it's like a read it at your own risk, because the moment you open it and you start reading, those words will jump out and they will grab you.
Oh yeah. I mean, I'm finding stuff like every day. I mean, I've taken like sort of a few months off just because it's so intense. I've taken a few months off
Sure.
to do other things, but most likely going to go back to it after the school holidays over here. But whenever I'm reading something, something's always popping out at me. For example, the Nazareth word linkage. I mean, when I was looking at it, I thought, okay, what if I break that up? And I didn't expect to find anything. And I I try not to kind of stretch things. Like if if the word Nazareth wasn't used, I wouldn't look at it. I wouldn't think, okay, that's a connection. But because it is used, and because Nazareth and Nazareth, it's the same thing essentially, then that's another little thing that you found. It's like, okay, wait a minute, that word relates to nobility and is referred to the aristocracy. I said, and is another little thing that just cannot be coincidence based on all the other stuff. But I mean, the more you, especially for me, the more you kind of understand it and the more you realize it and accept it, I think is the important one, that there is something else going on. And when you read the information, you can read it in a different way. You can sort of think, oh, wait a minute, they're being funny here. They're talking about something else. It's obvious because it just doesn't make sense. And it's like kind of, the mistakes in spelling, little things like that. And then, I mean, obviously I couldn't, without sort of reading the work of Eberhard Reuchlin and the guy, the scholar who uses the name Roman Piso, I wouldn't have been able to work out what I can work out now. But I'm glad I have, because it's interesting once you get to know how to do it.
Because now you're at the point where you are understanding the puzzle pieces and how they were put together, as opposed to just looking at a big 1,000-piece puzzle that has seemingly no logic to it, right? But at this point, you've been able to pull enough of the pieces together that it's you're familiar enough with the language that it's sort of jumping off the page to you now.
Well, I mean, the biggest one, the most recent one. I mean, I've done like sort of an article on Church Father Origen, which I put up on the website, and that had to go through, deciphering Emperor Constantine's ancestors, and who his father was, etc. But the one that was purely, I had to kind of figure out myself because there wasn't a lot of information about it, was the ancestry of Vespasian from Herod the Great. And the only thing that tied it all in, or started the path to piece it together bit by bit, was the name of his mother as Op Gali, who was recorded as married to Tigranes, king of Armenia, and she's obviously, she features on his coin. But the only reason I knew that Op Gali was or must have been the mother of Vespasian and the daughter of the king known as Herod Polio, or Herod, king of Chalcis, was one because of building sort of information about Vespasius Polio and Herod Polio, and just connecting their information. The dates and times match up, what they did kind of matches up. They're active in the same circles. So then you put that to one side, and then you kind of go into the linguistics side of it, where you kind of know that Galai can be Gala, I and A can switch, and Gala means the same as Polio. But also recently, which I've added to a paper which I got to send off to a journal, I was confused on the op part of the Op Galley name, and I couldn't figure out, what it related to. But then a little bit of searching brought up that it must have been the goddess Ops, which is related to the Sabines. So you've got the connection there. Flavius Sabinus, Sabine country, and I thought, okay, well it just ties it up again. It's just another link, and it can't be coincidence.
One thing, I just a thought maybe as we're kind of winding down here.
Yeah, I gotta go and fix my little boys in bed now.
Taking us to the final stretch. I have you seen the movie Jojo Rabbit? Familiar?
Rabbit? No.
Yeah. It's an interesting movie, and it when I watched it, it really drew like some interesting connections in my mind.
Yeah.
Where essentially the movie, if I'm not mistaken, it takes place in Germany during Hitler's time, and it focuses on a young boy who, throughout the movie, he has a sort of figment, imaginary friend who is Hitler. And
Right.
Hitler follows him around everywhere. He makes commentary on everything that he does, and what it is it's the way I take it is sort of a metaphor for the kind of psyops that were being forced on the general public, and how you have this young boy who, in his own mind, he has this like version of Hitler who follows him around and is critical of everything he does, and is essentially just like, you better not do that or something bad's going to happen to you, and the Gestapo's going to come for you. So, but it's like, at some point I'm like, man, I carry Jesus around in my head the same way that this kid carries around Hitler. Yeah. Like that was sort of the connection that I made, or at least, not that it was super intense at that point, but just I could see how Jesus was kind of living in my head the same way that Hitler was living in this young boy's head. And it really kind of was maybe kind of go like, whoa, like this is kind of how it works. This is kind of the sort of metaphorical experience that a lot of people are having in terms of their relationship to this deity, this character, this whatever, this figment, this psychological splinter. If you're raised in this environment, then Jesus is with you everywhere you go, making commentary on your decisions, and I think that's such a profound way of looking at it. And it's this, for me, watching that movie, at some point you're kind of like, it's this weird friendship that's happening between this young boy and this figment of his imagination. Which
I suppose it could be likened to the joke that people say that they sort of have Jesus like talk to them and stuff.
Right.
And you say, well, in any other walk of life, that'd be schizophrenia.
Right.
And it's kind of like, I try not to kind of like sort of belittle anyone for whatever, because some people won't ever change their mind. And I suppose that's not really my intention. My intention is, the pure historical side of it. But like, I mean, my mum is quite religious. And, she took me and my brother to Sunday school when we were younger. But I never gravitated towards it. I've never been religious minded or whatnot. Right. But I just said to, like she said, there's a soul, and I feel Jesus, whatnot. And I said, yeah, but Mum, that's like schizophrenia. And she said, oh, don't be so rude. I was like, it's not rude. It's like, if you didn't mention a Jesus name, he said, someone talking to me, it'd be schizophrenia.
Sure. Well, it is a strange, like, I mean, I would almost say like self-inflicted schizophrenia, or not self-inflicted, but like, inflicted by society or something. But it's strange because it's you might say perfectly healthy minds that have created this sort of like subcategory or something where there's this individual, there's this apparition that has been created in their own mind, or that they've created in their own mind. And it's that well, like, what's interesting to me is this idea that everybody has a slightly different version of Jesus in their own mind, you know, and when you look at this is one of my big contentions with organized religion and Christianity specifically growing up, is just at some point I could see the hypocrisy that was baked into it. You know, a lot of people who use the name of God or the name of Jesus for really strange reasons. And, you know, reasons that conflict with my own innate understanding of who the character of Jesus was. But then when you look at the information that you're presenting, and when I match that up with like not last 4 years, but, you know, the 4 years that Trump was in office and the kind of hysteria that he kicked up there, then it's sort of like it's like a real life example of how this works in reality, as opposed to just in theory and you know, in a person's head, right? In a person's head, the idea of Jesus can be, again, you know, love your neighbor as yourself, all this kind of stuff. But then when you look at how it functions in practice, that's when it gets really dark. That's the part for me as a Christian growing up, and eventually kind of like being intellectually honest about some of the things that Christianity perpetuates in the world, and then seeing all of that culminate with the 4 years of Trump in the office, and of course a lot of the insanity that we're seeing right now. It's one of the reasons why I'm interested in having this discussion. Yeah,
I mean, it's basically, I mean, it's the same with politics over here at the moment. I mean, over here is an absolute joke at the moment, but it's basically the same thing as, you know, do as we say, not as we do. You know, it's like when they write, you know, a sort of treat others as you'd like to be treated yourself. I mean, that's not original to the New Testament. That was I think it was Hillel the Pharisee, I think it was. I might be mistaken, but it was a Jewish thing. Okay. And they just taken that and reworded it. Gotcha. But that, like, sort of, you know, treat your neighbor as you would treat yourself. I mean, that's basically the aristocracy telling the people to, you know, you don't want to be killed, so don't kill us, kind of thing. So, you know, the people aren't going to do that, but the aristocracy will. You know, because like we're telling you not to do it, but, you know, we're still going to do it.
Sure.
It's just pure, it's mind games, but it's very sophisticated, subtle mind games.
Mm-hmm. I see a direct parallel between the moment where Constantine sees the vision of God and hears the voice saying, "In this sign shall you shall conquer," and I see a direct parallel to that with the moment where Trump is tear gassing protesters and he lifts up the Bible, and you know, he doesn't hardly know anything that's actually said in the book that he's holding, but the iconography of it is for certain people, like, that's what's crazy. You know, that was a crazy moment for me, because I saw that, and to me it was like, oh, this is the Antichrist. And then it blew my mind to find out that a bunch of people were like, yeah, you know, like he's got his Bible there, and he's representing us, you know, he's sticking up for us. And it's like, really? Yeah. Okay, so obviously we're having two completely different experiences and different apprehensions of what it is that this means. And that to me is what is the most disturbing thing. And I think that for a certain amount of the Christian population, I'd like to think that it's disturbing to them as well. But unfortunately, the way that I see it is because people, you know, politics has become so polarized, and people, they encamp themselves into whatever ideological beliefs their group shares, you know, and so you've got these extremes of the left and the right, which is something that I talk about quite a bit. It's a huge part of my platform and the discussion that I'm having, because this what we're talking about, you know, this is psychological warfare. This is you know, in the discussion of, like, You know, they're on the top, man. They're holding us back. They're holding back the information because they're trying to keep us down. You know, they're trying to keep us stupid. It's like, all right, well, this is definitely like a huge example of that. And going back to kind of what we were talking about earlier, in my attempts to liberate myself psychologically, intellectually from that belief system and sort of dissect it, it's been difficult. You know, it's been a that's not something that happens overnight. It requires time and patience, and it requires getting the right information at the right time from the right people. So that's all comes into my reasoning, my inspiration for doing something like this, because essentially what I want to do is I want to have a conversation that would appeal to myself. If I was to come across this video and like listen to what this, you know, I was saying, I'd be like, man, this guy's making a lot of sense. This guy's like, you know, that's the kind of conversation that I want to have, because I understand that there are people out there like me who are struggling with this, and they don't know how to categorize this psychologically. They don't know where to put Jesus in their minds. And so this is one of the reasons why I'm engaged to have this discussion about Piso and all of this, because my feeling is, okay, let's follow the data where it goes. Let's see what it says. Let's consider it, and then do something proper with it. In my mind, from what I know of many people who are Christians, the ability for them to absorb this information and to use it, I think for a lot of people, I said this last time, for a lot of people, this information would make their brains explode. If they tried to take this and integrate it with their understanding of who Jesus is and their sort of allegiance to their religion, I think for a lot of people it would just kind of create a psychological collapse. They wouldn't be able to handle it, because they wouldn't know how to live without that psychological construct in their mind, you know. To take that version of Jesus and to pull it out of their brains and say, this is fake and you've been duped. There's some people who just, they're so far away from that. You know, they so want to believe that there was a historical Jesus who did do the things as presented in the gospel, that to try to convince themselves that is not the case. Again, it's why I want to have this discussion, because I know that there's a certain amount of people out there like myself who are struggling, and they want to be able to categorize this correctly in their minds. And then there's a certain amount of people who just, they innately don't believe in Christianity. They innately feel like it's a farce and they don't want to have anything to do with it. But they live in a world where it's like you can't escape from it, right? So that I think to kind of leave us maybe on that note, and if you have any final thoughts to give, but just if there's anybody out there who, you know, you grew up in church and you're having a hard time trying to understand how to categorize Jesus in your own mind, like, who is he? Is he really the Son of God? Is he just some fabrication? You know, what does that mean? And are we dealing with a population of people who have a controlled form of schizophrenia? And what do we do about that? Do we start to criminalize those people? Do we, as a society, anybody who identifies as a Christian, if we want to try to come
to work? No.
Yeah, I mean that's kind of the
I think people have just got to I don't know. Well, like in your example, I think they've got to make their own decision. There's no point forcing someone to kind of like read something and say, oh, you know, understand it. I mean, this is kind of why, like, I don't sort of promote my book, you know, overly promote my book. I share articles every now and again, but you know, you're not going to convince someone, say, right, read this book, you've been duped.
Right.
This is the information. Because it wouldn't work for me. It's got to be the person's own choice to read it, because then they've taken the first step and they're open to reading it and thinking, okay, something's going on.
As maybe a little bit of a joke, to just seems somewhat fitting to quote Jesus right now, who said, "Don't cast your pearls before swine, lest they turn and trample them." This is kind of an example of what I mean of like dissecting this stuff and sort of looking at it and saying, you know what, I don't believe in all of this, but that thought right there, that idea right there, still has validity. It still has value, and it's one of the things that I sort of think about is part of the challenge of Christianity, is that it has been a vehicle to introduce certain concepts into the human unconscious. You know, it's not to say that Christianity invented forgiveness or invented redemption or invented the idea of the second chance, but it does. A lot of those ideas are contained within Christianity, and sometimes outside of that context, they don't necessarily. It doesn't necessarily work. You know, there's like outside of the context of Christianity, it's not to say that people don't believe in second chances, but there might be with some people a willingness to judge and sentence somebody on the basis of just not agreeing with them. And that is, I think, the conflict that's at work right now between, let's say, more academic, intellectual, atheistic types and people who are believers, and they're still heavily invested in this mythology. So this is kind of like the internal landscape that I deal with, because on one hand, I am very academic, skeptical, atheistic in my perceptions, but then on the other hand, I still have internally a lot of the psychological connections that I grew up with. They're not going anywhere. You know what I mean? They're attached to my memory. You know what I mean? And so that's why I'm interested in this discussion, because I feel like it's reflective of the reality that we're dealing with. Because you do have, you know, in terms of the polarity of the right versus the left. On the right, typically speaking, you have people who are religious, traditional, heteronormative, monogamous. You know, it's like all that kind of is on the right. And then on the left, you have very atheistic types, very liberal types, you know, everything that sort of encompasses what it means to be on the left. And for me, I deal with the friction internally. I deal with the friction of those extremes because I see things from both sides. And so I get frustrated sometimes because I hear things from both the left and the right that to me are not at all helpful to the overall conversation, helpful to the overall aim, I believe, of us as human beings being able to pull together and create a world that we can all live in. And so that to me is kind of at the heart of a lot of the drama that we're seeing unfolding. You know, when you look at what's happening in the States with MAGA and QAnon and all that kind of stuff, it's these extremes of belief that to some degree are defined by their opposition to the opposite of their ideological stance. And I think the same applies to the left as well, and how they perceive people who are religious, traditional, heteronormative, monogamous types. There's just this like somewhere in the middle, there's just this like animosity towards the opposite that really makes it difficult to come up with meaningful solutions that work for everybody. So that's kind of my my rant for anybody who's listening in terms of, you know, what is this discussion about and what does it mean on a larger scale. This is what I think it comes down to. You know, it's this like you're saying, like a schizophrenia that a certain amount of the population has, and another certain amount of the population doesn't have that same thing, and they look at the others and they're being like, you guys are crazy. But then the complicated thing is, as crazy as you think those people are, they are still voters, and they're still part of a democracy. You know, like what it is that the strange form of democracy that we're trying to all live in. But that's all my ramble there. And just before we go, like, do you have any other thoughts, final thoughts that you want to leave with us? I appreciate you indulging me, by the way.
That's fine. No, it's nice to listen. No, I don't think I've got any other real thoughts. I think it's just there's a lot of I suppose there's been a lot of sort of whitewashing of this particular subject over, you know, sort of a long period of time.
Yeah.
And so I think to kind of I suppose to get the correct information out there and not to have it dismissed is the goal.
Right.
And I suppose, you know, the first goal or the first step towards reaching that goal is to kind of get it you know, looked at and accepted by like sort of people in academia looking at the information, which I believe it is at the moment. But I mean, there's a lot of things. I mean, you know, that people won't, why people won't believe this information is correct, because, you know, if I mean, you know, as a last point, before I shoot off, another argument about why the Romans would create a religion and then, you know, persecute the very people that, you know, that they set the religion up for. I mean, again, within the current understanding of this religion, yes, I agree. Why would they set up a religion and persecute the hell out of the people if they wanted to make the religion, if they wanted to make it successful? But again, the persecutions didn't happen in the way that we've been led to believe they happened. The persecutions happened in the context of members of the elite family not being allowed to push the religion by those that were more in charge at the time. And it's only kind of after it's only kind of after, I think, Diocletian died, that we get the kind of like the martyr stories come out and like sort of names coming out of all the martyrs. And that's basically the relatives of Constantine, who died trying to promote Christianity during the reigns of Diocletian and whatnot. So again, there's so much to it that I will get around to writing more articles about it, but I can only do one thing at a time.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's a ton of information, man, and like the videos that you put out, they're informative. They you know, they're really kind of pulling back the layers on this. I highly recommend anybody who enjoyed this conversation follow Henry. You know, the information he's putting out on a regular basis is well thought out and well presented. I know that this is a difficult subject. No matter what side of the line you fall on, if you listen to this and you think it's all hogwash, then I understand where you're coming from. If you listen to this and you're like, this sounds like it's making a lot of sense to me, I understand where you're coming from. It sounds like it makes sense to me. You know, there's a lot of connections that you're drawing that to me go, like, for me on a psychological level, like it's reorganizing my perception of reality and how reality functions. And there's a whole just it's like a file of information in my brain that defines this history in a certain way. But there's another part of me that is like, no, I want the truth. I want to know what really happened. I believe that the truth is important. Knowing the truth is important, and I'm willing to look into it to find out what's really going on. And in the process of doing that, you know, 10 years ago, I didn't even know who Joseph Atwell was.
Yeah.
I was not at all familiar with his research. And then when I became aware of that, then it's like I had to take that information and I had to sort of like overlay it on all the other stuff that I understood. And with the information that you present, like it's like, okay, back to the drawing board, got to do it again, right?
Yeah.
But I think that it's worth doing. And for me, I would say it's to some degree, it's somewhat of a compulsion in that, and this is something I'm going to be talking about more in the future, but just on a level of mental health, this is something that I'm interested in because I'm concerned about my own mental health. I live in the world. I have to deal with paying rent and doing this and that and the other, just like anybody else. And functioning in the world when you have ideas like this in your mind can be tricky. Some people, they take to it like fish to water, and some people like myself have deep reservations about it, and that it makes it complicated because you are now in a situation where you feel like you're seeing the emperor with no clothes on, but nobody else seems to be noticing, and that can be a very isolating experience. So I know for myself,
it's a good job I enjoy it.
I'm sorry, say that again.
So it's a good job I enjoy it. When it's like isolating to sort of have information and it kind of like sort of not many people doing the same kind of research.
Mm-hmm.
So it's kind of like sort of you can only do this if you enjoy it and you have an interest in it.
Yeah. I think my interest comes down to is sort of it's an interesting connection in that, as a Christian, I was taught you will know the truth and the truth will set you free. And then the irony is, well, hey, guess what? All this is a lie. So you're going to have to start there. And that is, I think the commonality between people who are honest thinkers is that they want to know the truth and that they're willing to do. They're willing to go the extra mile and do the research, even if it makes them unpopular. And that is, like I might be able to have a lot more hits on my videos if I was posting videos of cats and me twerking or something like that, right? But instead, I'm posting videos about how Christianity is a farce and some other stuff too that I won't get into here. But my interest though is in intellectual honesty and being able to be clear in my own mind about the world that I live in. And hopefully if other people are interested in that as well, that if they stumble on my content, I'm hoping that that's what they find is some intellectual honesty and some clarity about some distortions in our world that have a heavy impact on us, psychologically, right? You're kind of going through the world in a haze because there's this information that you're being presented from the time you're a kid that it's difficult to categorize it when you don't have the right people leading you in the right direction. And I think that as humans, our ability to indulge in delusion for the sake of being a part of a community is something that is part of human nature, I think, and part of tribalism and a desire to be right at all costs and this strange primal urge to destroy any opposition. I think that is reflected in Christianity and in a lot of religions in general, but it could also be reflected in ideologies that people carry. And if others don't agree with them, then they're demonized and excommunicated and all this kind of stuff, right? It's to me, it's on par with throwing tomatoes at somebody in the town square when they're about to be executed. There's a strange element to human nature that oftentimes will delight in the suffering of those who we deem as being opposite to us. And that is the darkness that I see within Christianity. As positive as certain of the parables and sayings and stuff is presented, there is a darkness there that I personally am unwilling to ignore at this point in my life, and I'm kind of pointing my finger at it because I think if I was to put myself in a position of a believer, then as a believer, I don't like the fact that my belief system is being used as a mechanism for violence and conquer. That to me sort of flies in the face of what my perception of the character of Jesus is. But then when you start to dissect it more, you realize that a lot of the things that he said were actually borrowed from other people, right? They're borrowed from other places and everything. And so the wisdom of the world is filtered through these characters and how they speak to us. And I think that there's just to finalize with this, I think there's a connection there to some degree with the characters that we have today, you know, Batman and Superman and all these modern mythologies that we know they're not true. We know it's a farce, but it's still something that we gravitate towards and worship in some ways, you know, the way that we, I've got my Batman toy here in front of me. Right. So it's you know what I mean? It's like, it is a form of worship in some sense. It's a form of, I don't want to say idolatry, but just because that from a Christian perspective, you can call it idolatry. But what I'm speaking to is, as human beings, our tendency to create the gods that we worship. Yeah. You know. So that's my final thought. Henry, any last things before we wrap up here?
No, I think that's fun. I think I've got to go and put my little boy to bed.
All right. Sounds good. Well, thank you so much. We did a 2-hour run here and we talked about some really interesting stuff. Really looking forward to more of your research as it comes out. Looking forward to your book when it's done. Please, you know, keep us apprised of that. And just want to let you know, man, that I really appreciate you. You know, there's 8 billion people on this planet, and it's a pleasure to be able to speak to you personally and have this very specific discussion. It's helpful to me, and I hope it's helpful to other people as well.
It's my pleasure. Glad you enjoyed it.
All right. Well, thank you, everybody, for joining us. And like I said, follow Henry. If you like my content, follow me too. Comment. You know, the more comments we get, the more that we can respond to them in a future discussion. So just for now, thank you very much. Thank you, Henry. And we'll see you next time. Bye.